Hi guys, welcome to lecture one of the digestive system. The digestive system, it's how you get through each day. If you've ever fasted, one of the things that's fascinating about not eating is just how much time we spend eating and preparing food and thinking about food and planning and hanging out. It just is really, once you avoid it, you'll see just how much time we spend doing it. And so um, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And the funny thing about that is we always have gut feelings too. So one of the insights you might have picked up on from our lecture on the digestive tract was the fact that there's so much innervation. The nervous system in your gut, or there's a secondary nervous system. Remember that most of the serotonin in your body is produced by your gut, and that should make sense, right? Now, without food, you can't survive. And so let's look at some of those roles the digestive system plays and how it does it. Well, there are some major processes, right? We ingest, which means you take food in, and then we digest. That is, we break that food down into its chemical components. The first step is a mechanical digestion. So in the oral cavity, we begin, right at the lips and the teeth, we start to tear materials apart mechanically. And then you also make saliva that has digestive enzymes. So chemical breakdown begins right in the mouth. The digestive tract propels food through your body, and it also allows for the absorption of food. And then finally, last but not least, you get rid of what you don't want in a process called defecation. Now, when you think about the digestive tract, it brings up a central organizational theme to which we belong. As animals progressed, some of the simplest animals, like sponges or the cnidarians, don't really have a true stomach. Flatworms don't either. In fact, we are coelomates. Coelom, C-O-E-L-O-M, such a weird word, is an organism that has a tube within a tube body plan, and we're coelomates, or the roundworms were coelomates, but we have a true gut, and so we have a tube within a tube, and it's kind of weird to think about, but like you bring the inside world into your interior, and that's why you have all kinds of effective mechanisms for taking advantage of that and protecting yourself at the same time. So, when you digest, the point is to break down those foods that you've ingested into components that you can actually readily absorb across your cellular membranes. So that means they've got to be pretty small. And so we take proteins, which are made of amino acids, and break them down into individual amino acids. We take fats and break them down into their fatty acids. Typically, you'll absorb fatty acids or I guess some cholesterol, different components, but largely just fatty acids. We break down nucleic acids. We don't digest them, we break them down, and we will ingest those components, those nucleotides. And then, of course, last but not least, are carbohydrates. And we're generally breaking carbohydrates down into monosaccharides. So we mechanically break things down into small chunks, and then we chemically break things down into their chemical constituents. Here's a nice picture of the guts. Notice you've got this giant thing up top here, and that is your liver. Now, peeking out just underneath of here is the gallbladder. So the liver is associated with filtering your blood, but also makes fat, stores fat, breaks down sugars and all kinds of stuff. This tube coming down out of here from up top is the esophagus, and it meets this guy right here, your stomach. So when you feel like you have a full stomach and you grab your belly, you're not grabbing your belly, you're grabbing your intestines. These are your intestines. Your stomach's right up here. That's right. This is the costal margin of the ribs right here. So the ribs, the lower level of the rib would be like right around here. Okay, so your stomach's protected by it as well. And then we've got the large intestine, but first is the small intestine. In fact, deep to here, the stomach meets the small intestine. Small intestine is narrower. It's really long, though, about 23 feet. And then you've got the large intestine. Small intestine meets the large intestine here. And this is your appendix. And this is the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. So remember that we were in this tube within a tube body plan, and we call the tube properly the alimentary canal. And so it is a muscular tube that passes through the ventral cavity, right? Starts in the oral nasal cavity, down the front, just behind the trachea, the esophagus passes. Your pharynx at the back of the oral cavity brings us to the esophagus. And then I travel down right behind the heart and the mediastinum to this first juncture called the gastroesophageal sphincter. So there's sphincters all the way along the way of the alimentary canal. There's a sphincter here, the gastroesophageal sphincter. Here's your stomach. Notice it's got all these rugae in here. The bottom of the stomach is where I meet the small intestine. There's a lot of things that happen here. This rough-looking organ back here is the pancreas, and right here where the small intestine and the stomach meet, you have the duodenal sphincter. All right. And the duodenal refers to the fact that the first portion of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And at the duodenum, I actually can dump stuff from the pancreas, digestive juices from the pancreas. I also dump stuff from the gallbladder here in the duodenum. And the gallbladder is, of course, taking this bile from the liver. Small intestines, like I said, are really long. Their role is to absorb food. Okay, this is where the absorption's happening. Not too much stuff gets absorbed here. And by the time I get to the where the small intestine and the large intestine meet, we have this region called the cecum with the appendix here. And then the role of the large intestine is largely just to reabsorb water out of the feces and pack those feces nice and tight, reabsorb water and water-soluble elements until finally it's moved to the rectum and then the anus. Now, this liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas, as well as the salivary glands, are all considered accessory organs. So the primary organs are the oral cavity, esophagus, pharynx, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then the anus. Well, it's a relatively thick tube, and it's a muscular tube, right? Of course, remember that we've talked about these tissues over and over again, and you know, tissue starts off with a little bit of, it's kind of boring, but I think hopefully you're seeing the utility of understanding what epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve is. The interior layer of the oral cavity and the rest of your GI tract is a mucosal membrane, and we looked at our cheek epithelial cells. Remember, there's goblet cells embedded there. So that interior lining is epithelium, and its name is the mucosa. And the mucosa runs from the oral cavity to the anus. And of course, mucus protects you, and it provides fluid to allow the movement of food. It can trap particulates and, you know, bacterium, etc. So the interior lining is mucosa. The next layer is the submucosa, and you know, if you get a cancer in the GI tract, typically it's a bad cancer, and the reason is because just beneath the epithelial layer of the mucosa, you have the submucosa where there's tons of blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. And remember, one of the things that cancer does when it's fatal is that it metastasizes. So if you have a cancer in your esophagus or your stomach or your liver or your pancreas, often those those cancers are rapidly disseminated to the rest of your body because the tissues are so the lymphatic and blood vessels are so close. The next layer is the muscular or muscularis layer, and there's different layers, but overall there's two layers, and they lie perpendicular to one another. And that perpendicular orientation allows a process called peristalsis, which we're going to talk about in a second. But if I have a layer that contracts this way and a layer that's contracting this way, together they can kind of move things around. In fact, one of the new sciences that's emerged in the last 20 years is bioengineering, and they look at the structural systems that underlie living things and use them to create materials. And of course, there's all kinds of robotic muscles out there that have their basis in examining these structures. Last but not least is the serosa layer, and that's the outer layer of the GI tract. It's a serous membrane, right? It's going to secrete serous fluid so that the tissue is nice and slippery and you don't have a lot of friction. So peristalsis is really interesting. We all know about peristalsis at an intimate level. And so peristalsis is the ability to move things. Remember that one of the roles of the GI tract was propulsion, and peristalsis is this process of propulsion through the rhythmic contraction of, remember, this is smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle is oriented again in two layers through most of the tract. The stomach has 3 layers, but that when that muscle is stimulated to contract, whether it's through stretching, remember smooth muscle is stretch muscle, or through the autonomic innervation, those contractions will move stuff in a single direction down through the tube. So you could see an animation of that on the upper left, and you see some endoscopies of different body parts to the right. And then underneath there's a weird picture of a man's chest with a tube on it. And this is a guy who tried to commit suicide. And the way he did it was by drinking Drano, which destroyed his esophagus and part of his stomach. And so what surgeons did, and well, anyway, it's a terrible thing. And it's an interesting story. I'm sorry we aren't in class. Maybe I'll look it up and you guys can watch it as part of our content here. But they took a piece of his colon and attached it up into his oral cavity, and then rather than go into the thoracic cavity and go through all that trouble, remember that esophagus is running back behind the heart. You really don't need to go in there. They just put that large intestine on the front and connected it to his belly, and he could eat. Now, he has to eat quite a bit. I don't even think he had much stomach left. Cool story, but don't drink Drano. Well, the gut is highly innervated, and in the discussions about your gut, the intro unit, one of the things you learned about was how many neurons are in the gut. Remember, it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. If you remember, sympathetic innervation in the cardiovascular system causes an increase in heart rate. The opposite's true in the GI tract. And remember that when we think about the autonomic nervous system, we think of fight or flight. In the sympathetic causes you to run. And one of the things you don't want to be doing when you're running is digesting things, right? Your system is going to be focused on giving you the ability to flee, all right? So in the digestive tract, parasympathetic innervation increases the rate of gastric motility and the digestive process, whereas sympathetic kind of slows it down. Remember that the vagus nerve is really critical in providing this autonomic nervous innervation to the gut and the visceral generally. And what we're finding out is that the vagus nerve, this 10th cervical nerve, may be a pathway to the brain for infectious agents that come from your guts. It certainly has a lot to do with mood, right? Everybody's guilty of emotional eating, and we'll come back to that later.